So in the last few sections, we talked about the higher cognitive phenomena that we'd like to understand in terms of anatomy, physiology, and chemistry. So now we're going to go over some of that anatomy, physiology, and chemistry to get a perspective on what are the resources we have to work with. From the outside, most of what you can see in a complete human brain is the wrinkled outer layer that's called the cortex. But inside the brain, there are lots of other structures with characteristic forms. One example is the hippocampus that's illustrated. Others include thalamus, cerebellum, and so on. Each of these structures has a yet more detailed structure, like the CA fields and the dentate gyrus in the hippocampus. And all these structures contain cells called neurons that perform information processing tasks. And there are about 86 billion neurons in the brain, and there are lots of different types of neuron. The illustrated neurons are pyramidals of the type found in the cortex, and they're also found in the hippocampus. Neurons have a yet more detailed structure. They have a cell body called the soma, but they also have various extensions that bulge out from that soma, and those extensions are called axons, and other extensions are called dendrites. Each neuron has one axon, and this axon carries information from the neuron to often thousands of other neurons. Most often that information arrives somewhere on the dendrites of the target neurons. And probably every neuron in the brain is different from every other neuron on the basis of the different shapes of extensions and the exact identities of all the inputs and all its targets. At an even more detailed level, the soma, the axon, and the dendrites all have complex substructures. For example, where an axon from one neuron targets the dendritic tree of another neuron, there's a swelling called a synapse. The structure of the synapse determines the immediate effect of an input on the target neuron, and also the way in which similar inputs will affect the neuron in the future. And at an even deeper level, cascades of interacting chemical processes initiated within synapses at the surface of the neuron and going down to genetic information coded in chemical form in the nucleus of the neuron determine how a neuron responds to its inputs. So ultimately there's an immensely complex chemistry that underlies cognition. So how do we make sense of all this information? Well, this picture comes from much later in the course, and right now I'm going to use it as a bit of a signpost for where we're headed. After describing the physical brain, we'll develop an idea I touched on in the first lecture, that natural selection has constrained the physical architecture of the brain in a number of ways. This slide shows the results of those natural selection constraints. In particular, different anatomical structures perform different types of information processes. Cognitive tasks are carried out by combinations and sequences of information processes performed by the different structures. So once we've covered a lot more about the anatomy, the physiology, and the chemistry of the brain, this physical information process architecture will make it possible to see how all that knowledge can be related to cognition. We're working towards establishing the hierarchy of descriptions that we talked about in the first lecture. At the highest level, we'll be able to describe cognitive tasks in terms of information processes like condition detections in structures like the cortex and behavioral recommendations in structures like the basal ganglia. Then we'll be able to describe any part of such a task in terms of more detailed condition detections and more detailed recommendations in the substructures of those major structures, and so on, all the way down to neurons and the substructures of neurons. Even at the level of the information processes performed by neurochemistry, we'll see later that we can understand these processes as extremely detailed condition detections and behavioral recommendations. So we'll end up in much the same situation as in electronic systems, where there are two types of information process, although they're completely different from the processes in brains. And just as these two information models are the foundation for full understanding of computer systems, from transistors to features, we'll find an analogous situation exists for the brain. But first, we need to get a lot more knowledge of the anatomy, the physiology, and the chemistry.